1 year had passed since Daniel Cole died on the council station. The galaxy had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The war that had lasted for 1,000,000 years was finally ending. Not with a great victory or a signed treaty, but with exhaustion and reflection. The Council's economy had collapsed under the weight of human withdrawal. Hundreds of systems depended on trade routes that humans had maintained. Thousands of facilities needed repairs that human engineers had provided. The absence of one small species had revealed how deeply they had woven themselves into galactic civilization. Mordith and his conspirators had been convicted of treason and crimes against peace. The trial had exposed the full extent of their corruption. They had prolonged the war for generations to protect their profits. Billions had died so that a few could grow wealthy. The revelation had shocked species who had believed they were fighting for honor and survival. The Sara had resigned from her position as High Counselor. She released a statement saying that she could no longer lead a people she had failed so completely. She had pronounced death on an innocent being. She had allowed fear and suspicion to override her judgment. The shame would follow her for whatever remained of her long life. The Vrethek Dominion had grown quiet in the months following Daniel's death. Their fleets remained in defensive positions, but did not attack. Warlord Kethvaran had issued no declarations and refused all diplomatic contacts. Nobody knew what he was planning. Then, without warning, a single Vrethek ship appeared in Earth's solar system. It was small and carried no weapons. Its pilot requested permission to land and await escort to the surface. The pilot was Kethvaran himself. The warlord had traveled across the galaxy alone, without guards or escort. He had come to Earth to speak with one person. He requested an audience with Katie Cole. Earth's government debated for hours about whether to allow the meeting. Many believed it was a trap. Others argued that killing the warlord would restart the war immediately. Finally, they agreed to let Katie decide for herself. She agreed to meet him. She was 18 years old now, a university student studying interstellar relations. She had her father's eyes and her mother's courage. She had spent the past year learning everything she could about the galaxy that had taken him from her. The meeting took place in a small room with simple furniture. No cameras were allowed. No recordings were made. Only Katie and the warlord would ever know exactly what was said. Kethvaran entered the room and saw the young human waiting for him. She was so small compared to his massive frame. She could not have weighed more than his arm. But she looked at him without fear, just as her father had done. The warlord knelt before her. His great body lowered until his eyes were level with hers. He spoke in his native tongue, and a translator device converted his words to English. He told her that in Vrethek culture, there was a ritual called the Acknowledgement of Wrong. It was performed when a warrior had committed an act of dishonor that could not be corrected through combat. The ritual had not been used against an enemy in 800,000 years. He said that her father had come to his ship seeking peace. Her father had spoken truth to power without flinching. Her father had shown more courage than warriors who had fought for centuries. And the galaxy had rewarded that courage with death. The Vrethek had not killed Daniel Cole, but they had benefited from his death for a year while the war continued. They had allowed the injustice to stand while they considered their options. For this, Kethvaran offered the acknowledgement of wrong. Katie listened in silence. When he finished speaking, she asked him a single question. She asked what he intended to do now. Kethvaran rose to his full height. He told her that he would return to his fleet and announce an end to hostilities. The Vrethek Dominion would unilaterally cease all military operations against the Council. He did not expect peace to come immediately. He did not expect trust to grow overnight. But someone had to take the first step. He quoted her father's final words. Peace is worth any price. He said that Daniel Cole had paid that price. It was time for others to honor his sacrifice. Katie thanked him for coming. She did not offer forgiveness because forgiveness was not hers to give. But she offered something else. She offered her hand in the human gesture of respect between equals. Kethvaran stared at her small hand for a long moment. Then, very gently, he extended one massive finger and touched her palm. The gesture was awkward and strange, but it meant something that neither of them could fully express. The warlord returned to his fleet and made his announcement. The Vrethik would stop fighting. They would not attack even if the council continued hostilities. They would wait and hope that others would join them, seeking peace. The council, shamed and leaderless, followed suit within weeks. The Million-Year War ended with a whisper rather than a roar. Ships returned to their home worlds. Soldiers put down their weapons. Families began to imagine futures that did not include death. A memorial was erected at the Galactic core, near the station where Daniel had died. It was a simple statue carved from asteroid stone. It showed a human diplomat with his arms open in welcome. His face was calm and kind. His eyes looked toward the stars. The plaque beneath the statue was written in 100 languages. It said, "Daniel Cole, Ambassador of Earth. He planted seeds he never saw grow." Nina Brooks became the senior human diplomat to the reformed Galactic Assembly. She had worked for this moment for 20 years, carrying Daniel's vision through every setback and success. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, she placed flowers at the base of his memorial. She told new ambassadors that Daniel's greatest achievement was not ending the war. His greatest achievement was showing the galaxy that some species measured strength not by their capacity for violence, but by their willingness to sacrifice for others. Humanity's reputation had changed forever. They were no longer seen as insignificant newcomers. They were remembered as the species that answered murder with grace. They had accomplished through dignity what a million years of warfare could not. Katie Cole eventually became an ambassador herself. She served on dozens of worlds and helped negotiate agreements between species who had been enemies for generations. She never forgot her father's lessons. She never stopped believing that peace was possible. On quiet nights, she would look up at the stars and imagine her father watching over her. She liked to think that he was proud of what she had become. She liked to think that his seeds had finally grown into a forest. The galaxy was learning to be better. It was learning slowly, with many mistakes and setbacks. But it was learning. And somewhere in the void between stars, the spirit of a human diplomat smiled at what his death had created. Peace had been worth the price, after all. The news reached Earth 6 hours after Daniel's death. Communication relays carried the recording of his final moments across thousands of light years. Every news channel on the planet showed the same footage. A man standing alone on a platform. A weapon firing. A life ending in a flash of light. People gathered in public squares and watched in silence. They saw their ambassador murdered by aliens who had asked for his help. They heard his last words echo through their cities. Peace is worth any price. Nobody knew how to respond. The government of Earth held emergency meetings throughout the night. Military commanders demanded retaliation. Politicians called for sanctions and isolation. Diplomats argued about proper responses under galactic law. Everyone expected anger. Everyone expected threats. But something unexpected happened in the morning. The people of Earth made their own decision before their leaders could act. Human workers on council stations began requesting transport home. Engineers who maintained alien power systems packed their tools and left. Doctors who served in galactic hospitals submitted their resignations. Scientists working on joint research projects quietly ended their participation. Nobody organized this movement. Nobody gave orders. It simply happened. Within a week, Every human in council space had departed or was preparing to leave. Trade ships changed their routes to avoid council stations. Communication channels went quiet. Earth was withdrawing from the galactic community without declaring war or making demands. The council did not understand this response. They had expected threats and military posturing. They had prepared defenses against human aggression. But the humans were not attacking. They were simply leaving. Advisor Kelleth reported to the Sara that human departures were causing unexpected problems. A water recycling system on a mining colony had failed because the human technician who maintained it was gone. A medical station had lost its best surgeon. A research project that was close to breakthrough had been abandoned. The Sara dismissed these concerns as minor inconveniences. Humans were an insignificant species. Their absence would barely be noticed once replacements were found, but replacements were harder to find than expected. Humans had filled countless small roles throughout council space. They had taken jobs that others considered beneath them. They had worked in places that other species avoided. Their cheerful persistence had made them useful in ways that nobody had fully recognized. Nina, Brooks and Commander Paul Harris returned to Earth aboard the Starfall. They carried Daniel's personal belongings and his recorded messages. They also carried something more important. During the chaos following his death, Nina had downloaded Council security files that proved the evidence against Daniel had been fabricated. She presented this evidence to Earth's government. The file showed that Councilor Mordeth had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. He represented a coalition of species whose economies depended on war production. Peace would have destroyed their power and wealth. They had murdered Daniel to keep the conflict alive. Earth's leaders decided to make the evidence public. They did not demand punishment or revenge. They simply shared the truth with everyone who would listen. The message spread across the galaxy through unofficial channels. News services on 1,000 worlds reported the story. Keth Voran received the evidence aboard his flagship. The warlord had returned to his fleet after the ceremony, angry and confused. He had genuinely begun to consider peace. He had respected the small human who stood before him without fear. Now he learned that they had both been manipulated by the same enemy. He ordered his intelligence officers to verify the information. They confirmed that Mordeth had planted false evidence in council systems. The conspiracy extended to several council species who profited from wartime contracts. The peace negotiations had been sabotaged before they began. On Earth, Katie Cole gave a single interview to a journalist who requested her thoughts. She was 17 years old and had lost her father to alien politics she barely understood. The galaxy expected bitterness and hatred from her. Instead, she spoke about her father's beliefs. She said that he had traveled across the stars because he thought different species could learn to understand each other. He had known the risks. He had accepted them because the possibility of peace was worth his life. She said that she missed him every day. She said that she cried when she watched the recording of his death. But she also said that she was proud of him. He had planted seeds of peace that would grow long after his death. She still believed the galaxy could be better. Her words reached billions of beings across thousands of worlds. Something about her quiet dignity touched hearts that had been hardened by centuries of war. She was not demanding justice. She was not calling for vengeance. She was simply continuing her father's work in her own small way. The Sara watched the interview in her private chambers. The High Counselor had ruled the Velanti for 800 years. She had seen empires rise and fall. She had ordered countless deaths in the name of security and tradition. But she had never seen anything like this. The humans had been wronged. Their ambassador had been murdered based on false evidence. Any other species would have responded with violence or at least demands for compensation. Instead, they had simply withdrawn and shared the truth. The Sara felt something she had not experienced in centuries. It was a cold sensation in her thorax that her translators could not properly describe. Humans might have called it shame. Mordeth had been arrested and was awaiting trial. His co-conspirators were being identified and detained. The conspiracy was collapsing under the weight of exposed lies. But none of this would bring Daniel Cole back to life. Across the galaxy, beings from hundreds of species were asking the same question. What kind of people responded to murder with grace? What kind of strength allowed them to answer hatred with truth? The humans were supposed to be insignificant. They were supposed to be irrelevant to galactic history. But they had done something that no council species had managed in 1,000,000 years. They had made the galaxy look at itself and feel ashamed that the war continued. But something had changed. Soldiers on both sides whispered about the human ambassador who had died for peace. Commanders questioned orders that seemed designed to prolong the conflict. The seeds that Daniel had planted were beginning to grow in the most unexpected soil. Nina stood at the window of her apartment and watched the sun set over the ocean. She thought about Daniel and his final message. Sometimes the most important thing a person could do was plant seeds they would never see grow. She understood now what he had meant. The harvest was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The day of the peace ceremony arrived with a strange stillness over the station. Daniel dressed in his formal uniform and checked his appearance one final time. The dark blue fabric was pressed perfectly. The Earth emblem shone on his chest. He looked like a diplomat. He hoped he could act like one. Nina walked beside him through the corridors toward the great chamber. She seemed nervous, which was unusual for her. She kept glancing at shadows in doorways as if expecting danger. Daniel asked if something was wrong. She told him that communications had been unstable all morning. Her connection to their ship had been cutting in and out. Paul had reported the same problem with security channels. Something was interfering with their systems. Daniel told her to stay alert, but not to worry. Technical problems were common on stations this old. They would deal with any issues after the ceremony. Right now, they needed to focus on the peace accord. The Great Chamber was filled with representatives from every council species. Hundreds of aliens in strange shapes and colors occupied the curved rows of seating. Their voices created a low hum that echoed against the ancient walls. Great banners hung from the ceiling displaying the symbols of major powers. Daniel walked to the central platform, where a simple table waited. 2 documents lay on its surface, one in Volanthi script and one in Wraithak symbols. These were the peace accords that would end 1,000,000 years of war. His role was to witness the signing and speak the formal words of recognition. High Counselor the Sara approached from the left side of the chamber. Her wings were spread slightly in what Daniel had learned was a gesture of openness. Her compound eyes swept across the assembly as she moved toward the platform. Behind her came a delegation of Volanthi advisors in ceremonial robes. Warlord Kethforan entered from the right. His scales had been polished until they gleamed like metal. His honor guard followed in perfect formation, their weapons sheathed but visible. The Vrethak moved with the controlled power of apex predators. The 2 leaders stopped on opposite sides of the table. Daniel stood between them and felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere in this chamber were beings who had lived through centuries of this conflict. They were about to witness something their ancestors could not have. Imagine. Nina took her position near the edge of the platform. She was still trying to reach Paul through her communication device, but getting only static. She looked up at the observation galleries above the chamber and saw movement among the council security forces. They were taking positions along the railings. She tried to warn Daniel through their private channel. Her voice came through broken and distorted. Daniel heard fragments of words, but could not understand her message. He gave her a small nod to indicate that he was aware of the problem, but could not stop the ceremony. Now, Councillor Mordeth of the Sirath stepped forward from the assembly. The Cirith were a species that Daniel had not studied closely. They were thin and pale with large dark eyes and long fingers. Mordith had served on the council for 300 years as a representative of minor powers. Daniel noticed that the Zara's posture changed when Mordith approached. Her wings folded tight against her body. Something about the Cirith made her uncomfortable. Mordith raised his voice so the entire chamber could hear. He spoke in the common tongue that all species understood. His words were clear and sharp like knives cutting through the ceremony. He accused Daniel of treachery. He claimed that the human ambassador had been secretly communicating with the Vredak fleet. He produced holographic evidence showing encrypted messages between Daniel's quarters and Vrethik warships. The messages contained council military positions and defensive weaknesses. Daniel stared at the floating images in shock. He had never sent those messages. He had never even seen that encryption system before. Someone had fabricated the evidence and planted it in council databases. He tried to speak, but Mordith continued his accusations. The Cirith declared that the peace negotiations had been a cover for human espionage. Earth had allied itself with the Vredak Dominion to destroy the council from within. The war would not end today. Instead, a new enemy would be added to the list. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted accusations and demands. The Zara raised her arms for silence, but her authority was crumbling. The fragile trust that Daniel had built over weeks of careful diplomacy was shattering in seconds. Kethvoron stepped forward and demanded to examine the evidence. His golden eyes studied the holographic messages with intense focus. Daniel saw confusion on the warlord's face. The Vrethek had not sent those communications either. Someone was manipulating both sides. Paul finally broke through on the emergency channel. He told Nina that he had been detained by Volanti guards and could not reach the chamber. Security forces had locked down all access points. This was not a spontaneous reaction. This was a planned operation. The Zara turned her compound eyes toward Daniel. Her voice came through the translator cold and final. Under council law, espionage during wartime carried the death penalty. The evidence against him was clear and damning. She had no choice but to pronounce judgment. Daniel tried to explain that the evidence was false. He tried to tell them about the real enemy who wanted the war to continue. But his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. Nobody was listening to the insignificant human anymore. The High Counselor raised her arm and signaled to security forces in the galleries above. A weapon powered up with a high-pitched whine that cut through the chaos. Everyone in the chamber fell silent and turned to watch. Daniel looked at the weapon pointed at his chest. He thought about Katie waiting for him on Earth. He thought about Nina standing frozen at the edge of the platform. He thought about all the people who had believed peace was possible. He spoke his last words clearly so that every translator in the chamber would capture them. He said that peace was worth any price. He said that he forgave those who had condemned him. He said that someday the truth would be known. The disintegration beam struck him in the center of his chest. For a brief moment, his body glowed with terrible light. Then Ambassador Daniel Cole of Earth ceased to exist. Only a faint shimmer of particles remained where he had stood. Nina screamed his name. Kethvoron roared in fury and drew his weapon. The honor guards surrounded him as alarms began to sound throughout the station. The peace ceremony had become something else entirely. Mordith smiled in the shadows of the assembly. His thin lips curved upward as he watched the chaos unfold. The war would continue. The economies that depended on conflict would survive. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Outside the station, the gather fleets detected the disturbance. Weapon systems activated across hundreds of ships. The ceasefire had ended with the death of a single human diplomat. The million-year war was about to resume with greater fury than ever before. But somewhere in the noise and violence, Daniel's final words were being recorded and transmitted. His message was spreading across the galaxy at the speed of light. Peace was worth any price. The seeds had been planted. Nothing could stop them from growing now. Daniel woke early and prepared for his first meeting with High Counselor Lasara. Nina helped him review the protocols for addressing Volante leadership. Every gesture and word carried meaning in their culture. A wrong movement could be seen as an insult. The council chamber was enormous. Great pillars rose toward a ceiling that seemed to disappear into darkness above. Representatives from 100 species sat in curved rows that circled a central platform. Daniel felt very small as he walked toward the center of the room. Lasara waited for him on the platform. She was larger than the other Volante he had seen, nearly 3 meters tall with iridescent wings folded against her back. Her compound eyes reflected the chamber lights in thousands of tiny points. She did not move as Daniel approached. Daniel bowed in the Volante manner and spoke the traditional greeting. Lasara tilted her head slightly, which Nina had told him was a sign of approval. The High Counselor's voice came through his translator as a melodic hum. She welcomed him to the shem to the fine to the two the jibes came through his translator as a melodic hum. She welcomed him to the Viol Council and expressed her hopes for successful negotiations. Her words were formal and careful. Daniel sensed no warmth behind them, only the practiced phrases of an ancient diplomat. Lasara had been doing this for 8 centuries. She had seen peace talks fail more times than Daniel could imagine. Daniel thanked her and asked permission to begin shuttle diplomacy between the council and the Vrethok. Lasara granted his request but warned him to be careful. The Vrethok were dangerous and unpredictable. Many council diplomats had died attempting what he was about to try. A small shuttle carried Daniel across the void between the station and the Vrethok flagship. The warship was called the Crimson Dawn in the Vrethok language. It was over 2 kilometers long and bristled with enough weapons to destroy a small moon. Daniel tried not to think about how easily they could kill him. Warlord Kephoran received him in a combat arena rather than a formal meeting room. The Vrethok leader stood in the center of the sand-covered floor, surrounded by his honor guard. He was massive, nearly 4 meters tall, with scales the color of dried blood. His eyes were golden and slit like a serpent. Daniel walked toward him without showing fear. He had learned that the Vrethok respected courage above all else. Showing weakness would end the negotiations before they began. Kethvoran looked down at the small human and made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. He said that the council had sent a child to discuss peace. He asked if this was meant as an insult. Daniel replied that he was neither a child nor an insult. He was simply someone who believed that even the greatest warriors grew tired of endless war. He asked the warlord if 1,000,000 years of fighting had brought his people the victory they sought. The arena fell silent. The honor guard shifted their weapons nervously. No one spoke to the warlord this way. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on Kethvoran and waited. The warlord studied him for a long moment. Then he made the laughing sound again, but this time it seemed genuine. He told Daniel that he had more courage than expected for such a small creature. He agreed to hear the human's proposals. Over the following days, Daniel traveled back and forth between the two sides. He carried messages and proposals. He listened to grievances that stretched back thousands of generations. He learned the names of ancient heroes and terrible villains from both perspectives. Nina worked constantly to help him prepare for each meeting. She analyzed communication patterns and cultural signals. She warned him when he was about to make a mistake and praised him when he found the right words. Daniel could not have survived without her. Paul maintained security as best he could. He reported that both sides had assassination teams on the station. Someone wanted Daniel dead, but Paul could not determine who was responsible. He urged Daniel to abandon the negotiations and return to Earth. Daniel refused. He told Paul that running away would prove that humans could not be trusted with important matters. They had been given this chance because nobody believed they could succeed. He intended to prove them wrong. During a quiet evening on the station, Nina made a discovery that changed everything. She had been searching through historical archives and found a fragment of an ancient record. It was a translation log from the first contact between the Volanthi and Vrethek. Over 1 million years ago, the record showed that the original meeting had been peaceful. Both species had approached each other with curiosity and hope. But the translators had made a terrible mistake. A Vrethek phrase meaning "we honor your strength" had been converted into a Volanthi phrase, meaning "we will conquer your weakness." The insult had sparked immediate violence. Daniel stared at the document in disbelief. A translation error. 1 million years of war because someone had used the wrong words. Billions of lives lost over a misunderstanding that nobody remembered. He presented the evidence to the Tsar first. The High Counselor examined the records carefully and then dismissed them. She said that the war had grown far beyond its origins. The hatred between their peoples was real and could not be erased by old documents. Too much blood had been spilled for ancient mistakes to matter. Daniel took the same evidence to Kethvora. The warlord listened in silence and then asked if Daniel truly believed this changed anything. His ancestors had died fighting the council. Their honor demanded that he continue the war. Daniel felt despair creeping into his heart. Both sides knew the truth now, but neither was willing to accept it. Pride and habit had become more powerful than reason. He proposed a new approach. He suggested a symbolic ceremony where both sides would acknowledge that the original conflict was a mistake. They would not apologize or admit defeat. They would simply recognize that their ancestors had been misled by a terrible error. This acknowledgement could open the door to real peace. The Tsar was reluctant but agreed to consider the proposal. Her people were tired of war, even if they could not admit it openly. A symbolic gesture might give them permission to stop fighting. Kethvoron surprised Daniel by showing genuine interest. The warlord spoke of warriors who had questioned the purpose of eternal conflict. He spoke of young Vrethek who dreamed of building rather than destroying. Perhaps, he said, the time had come to find a new path. Daniel returned to his quarters, feeling hope for the first time since arriving. He recorded another message for Katie. He told her that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was plant seeds they would never see grow. Even if he failed, he had shown both sides a truth they had forgotten. Perhaps someday that truth would bear fruit. Nina smiled when he shared his optimism. Paul warned him to stay cautious. They were surrounded by enemies who did not want peace. The hardest part of the mission was still ahead. Daniel nodded and began preparing for the formal peace ceremony. He did not know that forces far beyond his control were already moving against him. The seeds of his destruction had been planted long before he arrived at the station. The message arrived at 3 in the morning Earth time. Daniel Cole sat up in his bed and stared at the glowing screen on his nightstand. The symbol of the Galactic Council rotated slowly in blue light. He had seen that symbol many times in news reports and history lessons, but he had never received a direct communication from them before. Daniel was 42 years old and had served as a diplomat for 15 years. He had negotiated trade agreements with the Kelthari and resolved border disputes with the Morvani. These were small achievements in the grand scale of galactic politics. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. They were newcomers to a galaxy filled with species who had traveled between stars for millions of years. He opened the message and read it 3 times to make sure he understood. The Galactic Council was requesting his presence at their central station near the galactic core. They wanted him to serve as a mediator in peace negotiations. The war between the Council and the Vrethik Dominion had lasted for over 1,000,000 years. Daniel could not understand why they would choose a human for such an important task. He called his aide, Lieutenant Nina Brooks, and told her to prepare for departure. Nina was 30 years old, with sharp eyes and a quick mind. She had worked with Daniel for 5 years and knew his methods better than anyone. She did not ask questions when he explained the mission. She simply nodded and began making arrangements. Commander Paul Harris would lead their security team. Paul was a tall man with gray hair and a calm voice. He had served in the Earth Defense Force for 20 years before transferring to diplomatic protection. Daniel trusted him completely. Their ship was called the Starfall. It was a small diplomatic vessel with comfortable quarters and advanced communication systems. The journey to the galactic core would take 3 weeks at maximum speed. Daniel used this time to study everything he could find about the war. The conflict between the Galactic Council and the Vrethik Dominion had consumed entire star systems. Billions of lives had been lost over the centuries. Whole planets had been reduced to ash and forgotten. The scale of destruction was beyond anything Daniel could truly comprehend. He read reports of battles that lasted for decades and weapons that could shatter moons. Nina helped him organize the historical records. She noticed something strange as they worked through the ancient documents. The original cause of the war was unclear. The earliest records spoke of a great betrayal and an unforgivable insult, but the specific details were missing. Later historians on both sides had filled in the gaps with their own versions of events, but none of them agreed. Daniel sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. 1,000,000 years of war, and nobody remembered why it started. He thought about all the soldiers who had died, believing they were fighting for a just cause. He thought about the children who had grown up hating enemies they had never met. The whole thing seemed like a terrible tragedy built on forgotten anger. Paul entered the room with a security report. He had been monitoring communications from the Council station and had detected something troubling. Ships from both the Council fleet and the Vrethik Dominion were gathering near the station. A temporary ceasefire had been declared for the negotiations, but the situation was tense. One mistake could restart the fighting. Daniel thanked Paul for the information and returned to his studies. He read about the major species of the Galactic Council. The Volanthi were an ancient insectoid race who had founded the Council over 2,000,000 years ago. They had 6 legs and compound eyes that could see in multiple spectrums of light. High Counselor Thesara had led them for the past 800 years. The Vrethik were very different. They were tall and reptilian with thick scales and powerful tails. Their society valued strength and honor above all else. Warlord Kethvoran had united the Dominion under his command through a series of ritual combats. He was said to be the greatest warrior his people had produced in 10,000 years. Nina brought Daniel a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. She asked why he thought the Council had chosen a human for this task. Daniel had been wondering the same thing. Humans were considered a minor species in galactic politics. They had no great fleets or ancient history. They were barely a footnote in the records of older civilizations. He told Nina that perhaps that was exactly why they had been chosen. Humans had no stake in the war. They had never fought on either side. They were too insignificant for anyone to see them as a threat. Daniel smiled at the irony. Their weakness had become their qualification. The Starfall dropped out of faster than light. Travel near the Council station. Daniel stood at the observation window and stared at the massive structure. It was shaped like a great ring with a diameter of over 500 kilometers. Light sparkled across its surface like stars reflected on dark water. Thousands of ships floated around it in carefully maintained formations. Paul pointed out the different fleets. The Council ships were elegant and curved, designed by artists as much as engineers. The Wraithic vessels were angular and covered with weapons. They faced each other across an invisible line with their shields raised and their guns ready. The peace negotiations had not yet begun, but the threat of violence hung over everything. Daniel received clearance to dock at the diplomatic quarter. He put on his formal uniform and checked his appearance in the mirror. Nina handed him a datapad with his schedule. He would meet with council representatives in 2 hours. A Volante official greeted them at the airlock. She introduced herself as Advisor Kelleth and welcomed them to the station. Her voice was translated by a device worn around her thorax. She led them through wide corridors filled with aliens of dozens of different species. Daniel had never seen such variety in one place. Kelleth explained the situation as they walked. The war had reached a critical point. Both sides were exhausted, but neither would admit defeat. The council had proposed peace talks as a final attempt to end the conflict. The Wraithic had agreed only because their supply lines were stretched thin. Neither side truly believed the negotiations would succeed. Daniel asked why they had chosen him specifically. Kelleth paused and turned her compound eyes toward him. She said that humans were known for their unusual ability to find common ground between different perspectives. She had studied the records of human diplomacy and found them interesting. Humans seemed to genuinely believe that enemies could become friends. Daniel thanked her for the explanation. He did not mention that he found it both flattering and terrifying. The fate of a million-year war might rest on his shoulders. He was just one man from a small planet on the edge of the galaxy. That night, Daniel sat alone in his quarters and recorded a message for his daughter Katie back on Earth. She was 16 years old and dreamed of becoming a pilot someday. He told her about the station and the alien species he had met. He told her that he loved her and that he would call again soon. He ended the recording and stared out the window at the gathered fleets. Tomorrow he would begin the most important work of his life. He did not know if he would succeed. He only knew that he had to try. The galaxy had been at war for too long. Perhaps it was time for someone to believe that peace was possible. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The stars burned cold and distant in the endless dark.